I'm here.
Councilmember Diedrich,
Here.
Councilmember Temple,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Carwin,
Here.
Mayor Estrada,
Here.
Commissioner Knighton,
Here.
Commissioner Thomas,
Here.
Commissioner Ramirez,
Here.
Commissioner Holler,
Here.
and Commissioner Madrid.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We're now on part 3 of the agenda, Pledge of Allegiance. Commissioner Diedrich, you're right next to the flag. Would you please lead us, sir? Thank you, Councilman Diedrich. We're on to part 4 of the agenda, workshop. This is where we discuss the planning overview / role of a planning commissioner. We have consultant Mark Teague with PlaceWorks to provide the presentation.
Mayor, if I may introduce the item. This item is before you as a result of a request for a future agenda item from the council to have a workshop with the Planning Commission and the City Council to do this overview of the role of a commissioner, Planning 101. We are honored to have consultant Mark Teague with PlaceWorks here with us this evening. Mark has been doing this work for quite some time. I won't give the number of years, but he's been doing planning and environmental work both in the private and public sector, and even in his work as a consultant, most of that is primarily assisting public agencies with their planning and CEQA work. So with that, I am happy to introduce Mark to the council and commission this evening.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And a couple of ground rules for this evening. Don't wait to the end if you have a question. Interrupt me. I have 5 children. I'm used to being interrupted. And if I use an acronym you don't understand, or I don't explain the acronym, call me on it. I once worked with a Marine Corps major who despised acronyms with a passion I cannot explain in public television. So I have learned to avoid them if I can. Planning is difficult. Planning the future is even more so. And one of the things we're going to go through this evening is how we can map out the future and what cities actually get to do. One of the things that usually disappoints newly elected council people is how little power there really is in being on the council. We have rules and regulations that we have to abide by. We have people from all over the world telling us what to do, and it seems like our ability to make our own decisions at the local level is curtailed. I'm going to give you some tools for talking about that. I'm going to give you some ideas and some information, and hopefully spark a little bit of conversation, if you will, with some questions. If we have time when we get to the end, I'll teach you how to read an EIR quickly so that you can be prepared for your next council meeting. We also have given you the PowerPoint, and after this meeting, we'll give it to you again with my speaking notes in it so that you'll have all of the access to everything we're going to talk about. Let's first talk about the legal basis of planning. As I mentioned, the federal government and the state government take great pride in telling us what we can do at the local level. We do have some things that we can talk about at the local level, but as you can see, we have we have NEPA, we have ESA, we have the California Environmental Quality Act. We have a whole lot of regulation, quite frankly, written by people that don't actually build things and is foisted upon people that actually have to make them work. There is going to be some conflict there every step of the way, and one of the things that we can do is figure out how to deal with that conflict and also how to deal with the public, who's even more confused when you have this word salad of laws that come at them. At the local level, we have something called the general plan. That is your constitution for the community. It is what sits atop the hierarchy of all of your land use decisions. Specifically, and we'll get into this in a little bit, every decision you make with dealing with land use must be consistent with your general plan. Now, the fun part is that the general plan usually has a lot of flowery language and mamby-pamby policies that can be difficult to determine what is and what isn't consistent. That's why these items come before you, so that staff doesn't make these decisions in a vacuum. Underneath the general plan, we have things called specific plans, zoning codes, other regulations that I'm sure have passed your desk, environmental guidelines, application submittal stuff, the building code, all of those things fall under the general plan for the city. The nice thing about the general plan is it is your roadmap for the future. It is something that you can do to tell the residents and people that want to invest in your community what you expect out of them. And the nice thing about that is because the general plan sits where it is, people can make investments. Millions of dollars are spent with the idea that the city has spent quite a bit of effort telling people where they want things to do and how they want them to look. That's important, and I'll come back to that when we're talking about considering items. So my favorite quote, though, actually is from Dwight Eisenhower, who says, "Plans are useless, but planning is essential." Because inevitably, as soon as we adopt a plan, somebody wants to change it. I guarantee you, as soon as you adopt a brand new general plan, the next meeting, somebody will come in with a general plan amendment. Picasso was a little more positive, says it in far more words than Eisenhower did, but it means the same thing. We have to plan, and then we have to act on our plans in order to make anything come to fruition. The difficult part, of course, is that the public, no matter how much money we spend on outreach, often doesn't come to our general plan meetings. If a typical general plan runs at $1.5 to $2 million, $300,000 to $400,000 of that is public outreach. And if we get 20 people at a meeting, we consider that a success. And that's true whether the city's this size, or 100,000, or 500,000, or 1 million people. Getting people to come to talk about the future is difficult. Lots of things compete with that time. Sporting, schools, jobs, people don't want to worry about it. The only time they're going to come darken your door is when something comes in that is suddenly a surprise, like an apartment project or a big Walmart or something. People then, it's immediate, it's now. Even if it's been on your map for 30 years, it's suddenly a surprise. Dealing with that takes a little diplomacy. So we talked about the tools of the trade. I'm going to go into this a little bit to talk about your general plan specifically, some of the zoning information, and we'll talk about how you review a project against this and what the various roles are. Because by the time it gets to the commission, staff has already reviewed it for consistency. And by the time it gets to the council, if it's on appeal, it's already been reviewed multiple times, and there's different roles at different places along the way. Your documents are the same or similar to those throughout California. There are subtle nuances between each of them that reflect your community and your community's vision. But at the end of the day, everybody has roughly the same structure here. The general plan is your vision. Now, when I first started planning, I could have given a wet slap about the vision statements. It didn't really pertain to me. I was processing use permits for building stuff. Give me something real to compare against. Give me something I can chew on. This mamby-pamby floaty language that's open to interpretation. It means something to everybody that reads it. It's complicated. I've come to appreciate establishing in your document your basic tenets for the community, what you find real. We want jobs. We value property rights. We want you to be able to build here. We want you to be able to live here. Those things are critical in your document, not to implement what's already there, but to implement or consider changes. Remember I told you as soon as you adopt it, somebody's going to want to change it? How do you evaluate those changes? We didn't think about this use at this location. Is it a good idea or not? Does it meet the values of our community? Is this something we want here? I'm going to ignore for the moment that something may be shoved down your throat by Sacramento. I don't want to get into that discussion just yet. But normally, when somebody comes in and asks you to do something, you can take a look at it and compare it. When you want to change your plan, there needs to be some bumpers for you so that you know you're not getting too far afield of the folks that did help you write the plan. General plans are long-term, right? We're looking at 10, 15, 20 years. In my profession, 5 years is short-term. 10 years is short-term. Once you're out to 15 to 20 years, that's medium-term. Long-term's over that horizon. There are projects, because I have been doing this a while, that I remember putting on a spreadsheet and starting to collect impact fees for that are now needing to be rebuilt because they're too old. So we look at cities in the long run. Yes, Menifee is a relatively young community, But at the end of the day, 100 years from now, you'll see things go through a continuity. Now, the general plans are becoming less general thanks to our friends in Sacramento, and we're starting to see a lot of legislation now that mandates that you build to your general plan, which is hilarious to those of us that actually have to do this, because you can't really build to your general plan, right? There's a lot of ambiguity in there. It was meant to be general. It says general in the title, and yet we're being asked to be very specific about it. So this, for example, is the entire paragraph of the requirements for your land use element. There won't be a quiz later. You don't need to study this. But I just want to contrast that to our friend, the housing element. This is one of dozens of pages of, frankly, almost incomprehensible legalese that takes a consultant to figure out, because we have to do a bunch of them, and then we have to get it approved by HCD. The same can be said for new safety elements. Sticker shock. When I first started doing safety elements, it was 5 pages and a couple of maps. We'd knock those things out in an afternoon. It was not a big deal. Now, because of evacuation studies and wildfire and other requirements pushed on us from above, these things are now costing $150,000, $250,000, and even then, there's no limit to what the requirements can be. So the regulations change, the requirements change, but we still have to deal with it at the local level. One of the things I like about your general plan is how it takes a vague concept and runs it down to implementation. So your plan is based on a value, a goal, a policy, and an implementation action. So the value, again, we talked about a little bit how that's exciting to have a clear set of values for your community. A goal is something that you may or may not attain, right? It's nice if it's there. It is probably unattainable, but it's worth searching for. Policy is how you would act. Implementation is usually something your staff is being asked to do. Identify something, adopt something, bring something back for you. It's important that you have this continuity, because this process occurs with every single one of your goals and policies of your general plan. It's also important because this is how the public accesses your brain, right? Because you can't be at the counter when we're explaining to a property owner what they can do with their property. Or you can't be in the room when we're negotiating with an applicant on what we'd like to see in their project, because it doesn't have the values, it doesn't meet the requirements of the city. And it's important that we have that, because staff, in order to do their job effectively, has to be able to tell within about 80% accuracy how you're going to act on a project. Why? Because by the time it gets to you, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars have been spent to be able to have the luxury of standing at this podium and asking you for an entitlement. As a property rights guy, this is a contract. Your general plan forms a contract between you and the community of what's anticipated and expected. Just like in business, breaking that contract can have consequences that you may not want. And so it's important that you have in the general plan what you want to occur. I know that seems like a blinding flash of the obvious, but a lot of communities ignore their general plan at their peril. And this is becoming harder and harder to do, because developers and property owners have gotten savvy to the new legislation that comes down that mandates compliance. So these are the elements of your general plan, and you'll see that I've listed 2 as optional. The only reason optional matters in this context is there are limits to how many times you can change your general plan. Because it's your constitution, you're limited to 4 times a year to change the general plan. Now, you can make as many changes as you want during those. You could rewrite it 4 times if you'd like. That doesn't apply to optional elements, and it doesn't apply to specific plans, which is why that matters. Other than that, they hold the same stature as all of the other elements. They need to be vertically and horizontally consistent. That's gobbledygook by planners, that we can't say something on page 4 that we contradict on page 44. So if we say at one point that the density is 20 units to the acre, we can't tell you later that it's only 10, right? So they have to be consistent that way. We can't have different roadway widths, because those matter when we come in for development. Development comes in, wants to build in front of an arterial, for example, there's more roadway width there. Well, if we say on one page that the roadway width is 110 feet, and then 15 pages later we say it's only 80 feet, which is it, right? So they have to be consistent. Under the general plan, you have a number of specific plans. This is a map out of your general plan. I apologize, Christy, I should have gotten a more up-to-date one if there is one, but that's out of your general plan. And a specific plan is cool because it bridges the general plan, the values, and the zoning code, which we'll talk about in a second. A specific plan focuses in on one or more areas of a community and allows you to do something that the general plan may not, in terms of may not be as precise, it may be vaguely suggested in the general plan, but in the specific plan, thus the title specific, focuses on one area. Now what's cool about a specific plan is you can ignore the zoning ordinance if you do it right. You can have a zoning code that is molded around the project specifically, and you can adopt it as an ordinance at that point and function that way. One of the problems with a specific plan, it's also a way of getting out of codes, right? And sometimes I'll see a specific plan, the sole reason is so they can have a 4,000 square foot parcel instead of a 6,000. I'm like, well, that isn't really the intent of a specific plan, but some communities do it that way. Pay attention to the specific plans. They are kind of a cool way of updating parts of your community without having to open up the whole general plan. They can be a lot of fun to get into. And like I said, they can also be a way of avoiding some codes. If people are doing specific plans to avoid your code, it's probably time to take a look at the code. It's probably a good reason for that. So zoning. Look, zoning's a wish list. We establish a list of uses that we hope is appealing to somebody that wants to come and invest in our community. The city doesn't build things. Can't put any plainer than that. We don't have a construction arm of the city. Used to when we did redevelopment, but we don't do that anymore. The city doesn't build stuff. So that means that we rely upon property owners and developers to come to us using our general plan and our zoning and build something that we think would be a good idea at that location. That interaction then requires review by the staff, the commission, and in some cases the council. That's why zoning is a wish list. And you list all of the uses you think might happen there, even though some of them you don't want, or some of them you haven't seen in decades. Some of my zoning codes still list hat shops, haberdasheries, and things like that, even though they've been out of style for decades. It depends on where you are and how often you update your zoning code, but some of the list of uses would be interesting. One of my favorite was we had to do a revision to a zoning code because they outlawed spitting. Well, if you think about it, back in the Old West, tobacco and tuberculosis were rampant. You couldn't spit. So we took that out. We also took out some other stuff, but it was kind of interesting. They hadn't touched their code in a while, you might say. Zoning comes in two flavors, usually. Euclidean, which we'll talk about. Oops. Euclidean zoning. This is what you're used to now. Setbacks, building heights. You're essentially building an artificial envelope within which you can build a structure. We now have things called design standards and other things that you can put in play. But at the end of the day, this is pretty traditional. It's not very complicated. It's what we've been doing. Euclid stands for a court case in New York. It is not the philosopher. Where's form base? Oh, I guess we took form base out. The other kind of code is form base, which deals with design and really looks at how the structure appears. I see those less and less because you need a lot of architects, then there's a lot of arguing, and then there's a lot of forgetting what was negotiated. And so the simplicity and the streamlining that was supposed to go along with that often gets lost on the cutting room floor, and it becomes complicated. If you want to see examples of form-based code, I'm happy to give you some examples throughout the state. They're usually done in very wealthy, very sophisticated communities with a lot of money to hire people to help implement them. Let's talk about ministerial versus discretionary projects. Within your zoning code, there will be a list of land uses. Some are permitted and some are conditional. You may not ever see the permitted uses. Those are typically ministerial, they're handled at the counter. Those are land uses that are approved usually at the staff level, unless there's something weird and bizarre about them. The things on the conditional use permit side are always discretionary. Now, when I say discretion, it doesn't mean the dictionary version where you get to do whatever you want. You're subject to the federal constitution, the state constitution, property rights, state law, and above all, your general plan. You cannot approve something that is in conflict with your general plan. You also can't approve something that's in conflict with the state law or the federal law or the Constitution. All of those things come to play when you act as an approving body. We try to take the guesswork out of it by ensuring that you have all the findings, and I'll get to a series of findings here in a moment. So a ministerial project is usually something simple, a fourplex, a duplex, a small shopping structure, 10,000 square feet or so. Usually if you look at the CEQA guidelines, California Environmental Quality Act guidelines, you'll see there's a list of exemptions in there. That's usually what ends up on your ministerial page. The discretionary stuff is usually things that is a use that's usually okay, but we want to make sure it's okay in the context that it's being proposed. Think drive-through. Think the awful squawk box at the drive-through. So you may be okay with a Panera Bread or a McDonald's next to a house most of the time, but I don't want to hear, "Hi, welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order at 4 in the morning on a Sunday in my backyard?" And so what we would typically do at that point is we would have a conditional use so that there'd be something for you to consider. Here's a list of permits out of your zoning code. I would strongly, I'm not doing anything, I promise, strongly suggest that you take a look at where things are designated. As you can see, the community development director can do certain things, the planning commission can do certain things, and the council gets the ultimate authority. As the elected officials, they are the ultimate decider, the ultimate arbiter of any indecision or any confusion that may have come up through the decision-making process. When you get elected, the buck stops there. And the council sets policy. So if we're doing A, B, and C and the council says no, then that's the decision that gets made, and the staff repeats that decision when people come in to the counter. And like I said, you need to be somewhat predictable in order for us to be effective. You guys are awfully quiet.
Mr. Teague?
Yes.
Oh, you actually put it in the universe, and I actually had a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so looking at the chart, we see 3 different columns. One that's designated for the community development director, another for planning commission, another for city council. My question is, can any member of the public appeal any of those decisions which are just left for the community development director, and can they appeal it to the planning commission for further approval?
I believe your code reads that way. Almost all codes read that way, that any decision made at the staff level can be appealed all the way up. The other thing I will tell you is sometimes the director has the ability to say, this ain't stopping on my desk. We're taking this to the commission.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing I will highlight here is this isn't etched in stone. You can go through the process and change any of this going through a zone change. You change your zoning code to reflect what you want to see. One thing I would point out is discretionary actions that require a planning commission decision and ultimately a council decision, it's a lot of money to stand here. So be certain that if one of your goals as a community is to be accessible, that we're not making people stand in front of you for something that you could put in standard conditions of approval. If you're making the same conditions of approval for the same projects over and over again, and yet having to go through the process each time, maybe you should look at your standards, maybe you should look at your zoning to make it more efficient. I'm not a big government guy, so the more that we can make it so people can walk in and get their permit and get on with life, the better. Let's have the important things come to the commission and to the council. Leave the unimportant things to your professional and skilled staff. That was just a little editorializing. I promise to keep that to a minimum. Okay, so within the land use zone, we talked about permitted uses. I just grabbed a screenshot of commercial and industrial zones. And this is a similar process or a similar table that you will see in just about every zoning code. Conditional use, permitted use, or not allowed. I typically, when I interpret the codes, when I'm wearing my hat as a planning director, if it's not listed, it has to go to the commissioner and council for an interpretation. I used to be the other way, and then people started to, well, you're not negotiating. Is this like this use? Let's make that decision in front of the commission, and then if that doesn't work, in front of the council. And then when we go and update the code, we put that use in there. That's how some of these uses get in here. That's how some of the procedures get in here, because we can't guess everything. 20 years ago, nobody knew what a cell phone or an iPhone was. 25 years ago, we were still renting at Blockbuster. For those of you that are young, there was a VCR. You had to go and get it. Nobody does that anymore. But there were people that changed their codes to put those sort of thing in there because they were a problem, and see where we are. So the codes should be more flexible and more useful, yet I will contend that general plans get updated more than zoning codes do. And I think that's backwards. I think you should be looking at your code every year, if not every couple of years, to make sure it's working for you. This is the pointy end of the stick. So the council role, as I mentioned, as the elected body, you sit atop the pyramid. You're it. Your meetings tend not to be as fun as commission meetings, just saying, having been to both. And that's probably because you have finances and personnel and a lot of things to deal with, whereas the commissioners get to focus on the community, the land use provisions of the community. Regardless, you are the final arbiter and final decision maker of the city, and it's important that when you get a recommendation from the commission and from staff, that you understand the discussion and the context that went into that, because you are acting basically as a judge on whether or not that decision was relevant or correct within the context of what you want for your community. If you decide to go against the commission for whatever reason, it's helpful to have a reason why you did that, rather than you just don't like the commissioners, which I can understand. At the end of the day, the reason that's important is because staff, you've set precedent at that point. And so when the next applicant comes in and wants to do something similar, we're going to say, well, the last project, this is what happened. And if we know that this project is different than that project, then we have a context to have that conversation. If we don't know, then we can't have that conversation, and it becomes a little iffy. The other thing I will suggest to you, that if your commission and your council are not on the same page, developers will stop coming to the commission, and they'll just go right to the council. And at that point, why have a planning commission? So those are heady and very hefty statements, but more than one agency has done away with their commission because they couldn't get on the same page. I like having a commission because it's a comfortable place for the public to come and talk about these things without the severity of being at the council level. I think you need to have a place where you can have an open dialogue with the community when it affects their homes and where they are. Like I said, I'm a fan of commissions. The other objects here are the reason why the council meetings tend to be a little more serious. You have budget, personnel, and other things that you have to focus on, whereas the commission gets to look at just the land use. When you're a commissioner, it's hopeful to have the pulse of the council, right? You need to know where the council stands on certain things and how they go through their thought process so that you try not to get on a different page. I think it's fine to disagree with your council, but you should meet pretty regularly and make sure that the commonality is obvious to everybody. If you're both struggling with your general plan, change it. If you're both struggling with zoning, change it. If you don't like the way things are defined in your code, change them. Go through the process and change them. But don't argue about it between each other, because you want the commission to be here as a buffer for you so that by the time things get to you, you know they've gone through the process. I know some cities have councilmen appoint a planning commissioner, some cities don't. Regardless, however you do it, have a workshop once a year. You have several things that are required: a general plan annual report, a housing element annual report, a budget that you have to go through every year. It's an opportunity to sit down with folks that are trying their best and get together and make it work. Bring in cookies. It's one of those things where having that conversation is essential because your staff benefits from that. And then when you have unity and you have at least clarity of thought, even if you don't agree on all the issues, it's easier for us to do business with the people that come in because we are the first stop of economic development. We're the first place people come. And what they want to hear is, yeah, we have a great commission, a supportive council, we've got a general plan, and we can get this done. That's what you want to hear because you're competing with all the other agencies in the area.
Real quick, before you go any further, on the last slide here about communicating, I mean, the idea is to tell, I guess, share with your commissioner as a councilman, this is kind of what the vision I have type of thing.
Sure.
I guess then would it be what about if you just say, hey, you need to vote this way? I mean, I'm sure it's not illegal and there's nothing in the code, in that word salad anywhere, but, is it appropriate, I guess? Because it's like you said, why have a planning commission if it's going to be, the same vote all along because of the direction that has been given? So have you ran into anything like that? And,
yeah.
What's the advantage of either way?
I think a little bit of hearty discussion and disagreement is healthy for a democracy. I think being able to discuss community values, be able to discuss how a project fits within your community values is healthy. I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that one body rubber stamp another. That seems silly to me. Why have two bodies if you're just going to do that? On the other hand, this should be done with a little bit of respect in terms of making sure that everybody understands where they're coming from. So for example, if you have a car dealer that wants to come in and the planning commission says, all the lights are too bright, we can't have that. And as a council person looking at the budget, you're thinking, well, if I get this Mercedes dealership here in town, we might be able to afford another police officer. So you have a different perspective on what that is. I'm willing to put up a little bit of bright lights if I can have a new police officer. Makes sense. Okay, so the decision, you won the vote. And then the planning commission will deal with the outcome from that. But I don't think you really want to tell people how to act. I don't know how you are, but that's the first. Get me to do something different, tell me what you want me to do. And so I think working together to figure out common ground to stand on for a project is great. I would prefer that those discussions not happen over a project, though, because we start to veer into territory where you may have to recuse yourself from discussion due to conflict of interest. You veer into areas where you start abridging people's civil rights, and it can be perceived poorly. So if you're going to have those discussions about bright lights, big traffic, those things, have them on the general plan level. Have them at the specific plan level. Don't have them when you have a project in front of you, because then your findings and your process is prescribed by your own codes. Does that make sense? I didn't make these up. They come right out of your code. And I won't ask anybody if they've read the decision. It's right there in your own code. So it's right there. Yes, sir.
So I want to make a comment on this because I'm the old guy here. So there's a viewpoint that the commission's authority and power is simply to enforce the general plan, the land use, and those definitions. Over the years, I've asked different city attorneys, different planning directors and such, that we do also have a spectrum of judgment as far as, does that comply with the intent of the code? Does that comply with the intent of the general plan? So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would want the new commissioners to understand, this is my understanding, is that yes, you have to say, does that building comply with the land use and zoning for that parcel? But there is also, is it designed in a way that is consistent with the development code? Is it consistent with our design standards? Is it consistent with the overall use of the area? So there is some breadth there that we can make some judgment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you should stand here and give the presentation. That was spot on. That was exactly right. If it was simple, if it was just a matter of measuring the setback and saying the building is 25 feet tall and the width of the building is this, we don't need a planning commission for that. The difficulty is that determining when something's,
That's a broad word, consistent.
Exactly. I once spent 3 hours of my life that I'll never get back listening to a planning commission discuss whether blue is a natural color. It was for a sign.
Yeah.
Just telling you, right?
Yeah.
So the conversations can go in odd places. But in this particular context, yes, we can't, it's impractical to poll the entire city to ask these questions. And so you're acting as a proxy for the city and looking at that and going, yeah, that makes sense, right? That works. And if the community says, well, Chris is wrong again, let's take it to the council. then the council gets to make that final decision. But I think you're 100% on that. I couldn't have explained it any better myself. You are to fill in the gaps between the absolutely objective measurements and those squishy words like consistency or same as or similar to.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll expand it a little bit. And the reason I bring that up is there have been people standing at that dais who have said, how dare you make the decisions you're making, because you can only go within this column and letter of the law. And I obviously don't believe in his interpretation of that or their interpretation. And so I don't want any of the planning commissioners to be afraid to make judgments.
Yeah, I mean, we need to qualify that. You can't,
Yeah.
if the general plan says red, red's what it is.
That's an objective standard. Yes.
If the general plan says a range of colors from red to green, then you can have your opinion and your judgment, right? So unless there's an absolute, then everything's up for grabs. And that's kind of the definition of discretionary, right? If it wasn't the case, we wouldn't bring it before you. It's pretty simple for our perspective, but it can be hard for the public to understand. One of the questions that we always get at the podium is, I can't believe staff even brought this project to you. And these are the same people that would argue with me at the counter about their property rights. It's like, well, other people have property rights too. It can't just be your property. But that is a common question that we get. Why is this project even here? Well, because our general plan, our zoning, says that this is one of the projects that we'd be willing to look at. And because it's discretionary, we're here to look at it. I will also tell you that no is the most underutilized power of the commission and the council. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So here's the staff. Staff works for the city manager. I need to make that abundantly clear because some commissions think the staff work for them and have to make all sorts of requests, and then it gets a little awkward. I would like to suggest to you that staff works for the city manager. You can't just tell them what to do. You have to go through the city manager. I once got in trouble because a commissioner called me up and asked me to do something. I did it, and then I got yelled at by the city manager and the commissioner because he didn't get what he wanted. That was fun. So our job is to bring to you our opinion. That's what it is. We've looked at the project, we look at the code, we bring it to you and say, this is what we think. Most of the time, when it comes before you, it usually has a recommendation of approval. And the reason for that is most people don't want to spend the money to come stand here if we're going to recommend denial. Not all, but some. That doesn't mean that those projects are bad or dead. It's simply that we've taken all of the precedent that the commission and the council have come up with, and we've explained it to the property owner, to the developer, and they've decided to modify their project accordingly. We look at all these things, we bring it to you. Once it's on the agenda and before you, a whole nother spate of laws take into effect about who you can talk to and how you have to declare that. I'm not going to get into any of that. I just want you to know that staff takes a lot of pride in pulling these things together. One of the things you need to know is by the time it gets to you, it may have been on our desk for a couple of years, because if they've had to go through the environmental process and they've had to go through it, it takes time to get before you. So we know a lot about the project, then we have to summarize it in something that you can actually read over a few days before your meeting. So there's always more to be had. If you have any questions, call your staff. Simple as that. I don't know a single staff member that won't drop what they're doing to answer a commissioner or a council person's question. If you're a councilman, you probably have to call the city manager, who then brings the person in, whatever your protocol is. But staff is there and will answer your questions. And I'm not getting the evil eye from Cheryl, so I'm assuming that's still correct. Making decisions as a planning commission. Okay. We have things called findings, and I'll get to those in just a second. One of the things that the staff report is designed to do is help you review the findings and make a decision. It's documented for the record because if we get challenged, and it is possible to get challenged even on approvals, if we get sued, if the judge has nothing to look at, then he's going to use a phrase called arbitrary and capricious, which is basically the death knell of a government decision. So you want to be very clear and deliberate in what you're doing. We lay out the information, the facts as we perceive them. That's an important consideration in front of you. We try, if they're objective, hey, does it meet this zoning? Yes. Is it general plan? Yes. And hopefully most of them are yes or no. There's usually 3 outcomes. Approval, yay, everybody's successful, and they make a lot of noise, you have to stop the meeting. Continue for reasons. Sometimes there's a reason to continue. I've seen, bless you, I've seen more than one applicant stand in front of the council and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Let me work it out with staff and bring it back. I get the gist, we'll take care of it, we'll bring it back to you. That's a good idea. And then denial. Now, denial is complicated, particularly at the planning commission level, because it can always be appealed to the council. And the attorney may hate me for this. Not all recommendations require findings. Legislative actions such as general plan and zoning don't require findings. I would implore you not to go down that path. If you're going to deny something, right, explain why. It's helpful to the staff, it's helpful to the public, it's helpful to the applicant. You don't have to be elaborate about it, but make sure that it's not, well, I don't like the fact that Mark wore a wool coat, right? There should be something specific to the project or the context, ideally something from your general plan that you're leaning on. Make sure there's a reason that you've said no. Yes, sir.
What's the recent legislation that says it talks about objective findings now? That it was more specific that.
It depends on the land use action. They're tweaking the findings a little bit, but in general, your findings should be repeatable.
Well, they should be, yeah, objective and reasonable, but there was some new legislation that limited the scope of our reasons. Well, Sim, you can opine on that or talk about that, Jeff?
Commissioner Thomas, I think you're referring to the objective design standards
Okay,
that go
there we
in,
go.
that are part of housing legislation. Local agencies used to have quite a bit more discretion about whether a housing projects met a standard, and the state, as part of its overall housing legislation, has turned the screws on that and required that the standards be objective.
Okay, so it has more to do than at the plan approval level and that kind of thing? Okay.
So here's your findings. The actual decision, standards applied to the decision, findings of fact, and a statement explaining the process to appeal. We used to read this at the end. If a project was denied, we would explain to the public and everybody. I tend to include that in every agenda. Projects on this particular agenda can be appealed, and I give the statute piece. Everybody Googles the municipal code now, but there's, you know, I think it's important that your community be able to petition their government for decision and to get a reason why decisions were made. And so I like to make sure that's advertised for the folks that are there. Plus, it's just good planning practice. These are findings from your ordinance for a minor use permit or a major conditional use permit. You will see that the very first finding is your condition is consistent with the general plan. This means we can't do commercial in a residential designation. We can't do certain things in certain areas because our general plan doesn't provide for that. Now, in many instances, there's a workaround that we can do if we have something like that Mercedes dealership or the Ferrari dealership we want to have in town. We find a way to make it happen so the city manager doesn't come down on us. Even if that way is, as part of the application, we're changing the general plan and we're changing the zoning to do it all at the same time so that we're not running somebody through the ringer multiple times. And you'll see that some of these other findings are pretty basic, objective stuff that you can list. The last one there, design and location of the use will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare. That's the part you're talking about, Chris. That's the part that's been ratcheted down by the state for certain projects. Still applies to commercial and industrial, non-res stuff. Still applies to some market rate housing. So it isn't totally out of your purview, but it has been ratcheted down. I want to bring up a variance because lots of times if I can't do it in the code, I want a variance. I don't want to change the code, I want a variance. Variances should be and are very difficult to obtain because you're giving somebody specialized relief from the law, and there should be a reason for it. There's the government code on the left. There's our own code on the right that parrots it and puts it into a series of findings. If you're being requested for variances, similar variances over and over again, usually I see them for setbacks or lot sizes, change your code. If you're approving them, change your code. because you're just running people through the ringer and you've already decided. So it's a simple matter to change the code. All right, CEQA, Latin for delays project. All right, it's a complex thing. It stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. That's one of the nicer things it's called, depending on what environment you're in. I'm going to demystify it, and I'm going to tell you that it's simply a study. It should not drive your decision-making. It should never be atop your decision tree. It's simply one piece of information for you to consider. There are hoops to jump through, for sure, but the intent of the environmental process is to give you the ability to make the decision. And that will be confusing to people that want to weaponize CEQA, because force me to do an EIR, I've now given the council every tool they need to approve the project, whether you like it or not. CEQA is a risk management tool. What we're trying to be is on the left for substantial evidence versus on the right, which is fair argument. You're going to start to see fewer and fewer negative declarations and mitigated negative declarations because they're not less expensive than an EIR. You have to have the same substantial evidence to make the findings. They can take as long, if not longer, than an EIR. And at the end of the day, you've got, a bubblegum defense ability, a fair argument, which essentially means somebody that's quasi-credible could stand in front of the judge and say, I disagree. And the judge, being overworked and annoyed, will likely say, go back and do an EIR because that's the gold standard. On the left side, you see substantial evidence. That means in order for that person to stand in front of you, they have to do their own analysis. It's a much higher bar to follow. And that's interesting because the courts of late have been all over that, where if you come in with an exemption, that is substantial evidence level of protection. And that would have been weird to planners 20, 30 years ago. One of the most recent cases that I find interesting was San Diego, the Hilltop case, where the staff said this was exempt, the Planning Commission said it was exempt. It got to the Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors said, nah, look at the room, it's full of people. We'll do an EIR. It got taken to court, and the judge said, no, you do not need an EIR for this project. It met the standards for an exemption. And you go back to the CEQA guidelines, and it says, once you've determined that a project is subject to CEQA, you shall then determine whether it's exempt from CEQA. There's no ambiguity in that. You first have to do the analysis for exemption. And so these are risk management documents. I've been in the room with attorneys arguing with me that they wanted an EIR instead of a neg deck, even though they could have easily gotten the project with a neg deck. Why? So that when they were challenged, they had that level of protection. The same technical studies get done. It takes the same amount of time for the studies anyway.
So you're saying it's not optional to do an EIR if it's not required? So it's
That's what the court said. Now remember, it's one court case, it's not a whole slew of them, but I believe, based on the decision that I read in that case, your mileage may vary, that if it qualifies for an exemption, it qualifies for an exemption. Having been a practitioner of CEQA for a while now, I will tell you that the streamlining we need is already in there. What we've lacked is the courage to use it. There's lots of stuff in there. You'll hear an exemption called 15183, 15183. That essentially says is once you've done an EIR for a specific plan or a general plan or zoning, you're done if the project is consistent with that EIR. It's been there a long time. It wasn't added recently. It's not a new revision. It's been there almost since the beginning. And yet it's as if people have just discovered that exemption. I would contend, and I will tell you publicly, that most of the EIRs are not for environmental reasons, they're for political reasons. Now, I have to make a house payment, so please don't change that part yet. Exemptions come in different flavors. 15183 I just talked about, statutory, categorical. Trust me on this. The public knows about them, developers know about them. One of the funniest things I get is when they come in and say, well, we're going to do this exemption. Time out, Sparkles. This is not your call. This is the lead agency's call. In this case, it's the city's call. We'll take a look at that. But exemptions are important. They are no longer one page, though. So the old days when we'd write 3 sentences that essentially repeated the exemption, can't do that anymore. Now they're backed up with substantial evidence to justify the various findings. I won't get into that. If you go to the Commissioners Academy, I'll teach you there. Let's talk about mitigation really quick. All mitigation measures are conditions of approval. Something that's a surprise to most councils and commissions is CEQA gives you no power you don't already have. So if you can't require Caltrans to build an interchange, it cannot be mitigation. So just putting it out there that you have limitations on your power, they end at your city limits, and even then within the confines of the Constitution. We mitigate to the threshold of significance. We do not mitigate for past ills. So if you've allowed 3 legs of an intersection to be built, nobody built the signal, the last guy in isn't responsible for the whole signal. Some of this stuff is common sense, some of this is fairness, and some of this has come out because there have been bad actors, and so the laws have changed. There are specific laws for how things get done for mitigation and whatnot. Just be aware that some of the mitigation sounds good in paper and can be very expensive to implement. Mitigation measures must be enforceable by your agency. We talked about that. And here's the point, they must be linked to a significant impact. Nothing puts sprinkles on my cupcakes more than when I get a tech sub who says, well, there's no real impacts, but we recommend doing A, B, and C. Get that nonsense out of there. You have no authority. We have no ability to require A, B, and C unless there's an impact. If there's no impact, I can't mandate this. To be clear, mitigation measures change the project and they cost money. And everybody will discuss that. So you can't put mitigation measures on a project, but you can always put conditions of approval. The difference is one's negotiable and one isn't. CEQA streamlining, what this really means in today's day and age is the elimination of public review. And as painful as public review is, I think it's an important part of the process. I would contend to you 2 things to think about. One, the EIR should not be the first time people hear about the project. Should not be the first time they hear about it. They will not be happy. They will not enjoy the experience. And the second thing is, don't wait for the EIR consultant to solve the issues with the project. You will not like my solutions, I guarantee it. Do the planning, and then we'll report on the planning. But CEQA streamlining really means eliminating people from the conversation. I have mixed feelings about that. That's almost a beer and pizza discussion. But there has been, my standard spiel on this is that the legislature has given up revising CEQA, now they just avoid it altogether. So that's why they're declaring things ministerial, because it doesn't trigger CEQA. It's like, well, if you're not gonna fix it, why are you forcing all of us to deal with it? Impacts that cannot be mitigated to less than significant. If you remember, I talked about the threshold, and that's where we mitigate to. Sometimes we can't get there from here, right? If it's a global problem, I don't know how the city of Menifee is going to solve that problem, okay? So when we have those issues, we have to do a statement of overriding considerations. And what that means is a set of findings that says, yes, we know this is going to cut down a rare and endangered mushroom, but we want this Mercedes dealership because it means jobs to the community. It will help resolve a traffic impact. It will do these benefits to our community, and therefore we're going to approve it. So there needs to be a nexus between your decision, the environmental impact, and why you're going through with it. They're not complicated, but it is weird that they often ask the EIR consultant to write them. Now keep in mind, I've just spent 2 years writing the most objective analysis with no politics, no leaning one way or the other, and then I have to write a set of findings that says, oh yeah, ignore all that. By golly, you should approve project anyway. Yes, sir.
So do those overriding considerations have to be mathematically calculable, or is it a judgment, like it's so far over here, we're gonna get $1 million in tax revenue, we got jobs, it doesn't matter if we kill the mushroom? Or does there have to be some kind of objective rationale, such as there's $2 million coming in? I mean, where is that line? Because I've looked at projects like these, and I've always been wondering about, there's all these problems, we've mitigated to this point, and there's nothing more we can do, but we're gonna approve it. I always got a little nervous thinking, can this get sued later and overturned? So where's the line? How do you draw how far over that line you have to go?
To the maximum extent possible, if you've got numbers, judges love numbers, even if they're meaningless like a traffic study. Judges love numbers. Sorry, Brian. He's heard that before, though. Judges love numbers. So if you have the numbers, for example, I did an EIR for the destruction of a historic structure on a school ground. It was built in the 20s. It was sinking into the ground. You entered at one end of the building, and the ceiling was 8 feet. At the other end of the building, it was only 5.5 feet. Okay? We had a structural engineer come in and say, it would cost more to rebuild this building than it would to tear it down and build one just like it. And that was enough for some of the findings. The cautionary tale that we train our planners on is numbers can't be the only reason. And part of that is NEPA, upon which a lot of this is based, doesn't care about how much it costs, because NEPA really applies to government projects, and for some reason nobody cares how much the government spends. For private projects, it shouldn't be the only thing. There should be some ties, and if you can remember the main document, the vision document for your community, your general plan, this doesn't fit here because, or we want to approve this because it furthers this goal of our community. You want to have as many as you can put in there, because you only need one to make the override float. So it's best to have more. If you can make them objective, great. You can't always do that.
Mr. Teague, I have a question following up on that.
Yes, sir.
We want to have statistical findings and measurements and numbers, and we want to provide educated answers and reasons. Now, how much can we put into account, let's say the room is filled here at City Hall or at a planning commission meeting, and 100 residents don't feel like it's a community benefit? How much can we weigh community sentiment into the decision?
A couple things about that. Just because somebody comes here to complain doesn't mean they're speaking for the community at large. Somebody's always closer to the issue than everybody else. Just because somebody's not here doesn't mean they're in favor of the project either, right? So if you're going to use community gain, I would suggest that you do more than just having a room full of people. That's mob rule at that point, and that encourages that kind of behavior. If it's truly a controversial project, remember I said don't have the EIR be the first time they see that. Do your community outreach before the EIR comes out, even during the EIR if you need to. Take the pulse of the community, take several pulses of the community. Use electronic means. There's a lot of ways of doing this now. If it's that controversial of a project, that's great. But at the end, it's your decision as a council. Your decision to put the finding in there. The majority of the people don't like the project, probably isn't going to impress the judge much, right? He's going to look at your general plan, he's going to look at the zoning, he's going to look at all of the record leading up to that decision. What led you to that decision? If you just went, that's probably not going to impress the judge much. Just being honest.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Teague?
Yes, sir.
At one point, you said that decisions set precedent.
Yes.
Can you give something applicable to our city where that's worked in a negative fashion and in a positive fashion, where decisions have set precedents and a council or commission has overstepped or done something
You're
inappropriate?
trying to get me killed, aren't you?
I'm curious.
Specific decision. I can give you a class of decisions that set. I'm sorry, I don't have the institutional knowledge that your staff has. But typically where I see this, let's go back to our drive-through. I've seen it where planning commission says, you have to flip the site plan because I don't want that drive-through near these people's houses, these backyards. And that forces a whole new redesign of that end of the project because they have it designed a certain way for traffic flow and whatnot, but that's been the issue. And then at this community I was in, the council overturned that. And so we had the planning commission set one precedent that protected the neighborhood. We had the council overturn that decision and thoroughly annoy the neighborhood. Interestingly enough, several of those council members weren't able to vote on the next time. I've also seen it where we've had daycare. Now, you would think daycare would be okay, right? But I had 5 kids, so I'm not a good judge of this. I had a daycare at my house. I couldn't get rid of them. So, but in this particular instance, the daycare was next to a senior citizen facility. Now, if there's one thing I can tell you is crotchety old men like me don't want to hear people screaming at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the daycare facility. And that became a tug of war between the Planning Commission and the council. And that became interesting because the council remanded it back to the Planning Commission saying, we want you to reconsider placing this in a different location. And then it ultimately, the Planning Commission decided, it was appealed, and the council moved it someplace else. So the staff took from that, don't do that again, right? Don't put senior citizens and daycares next to each other. Most of the time, it's more nuanced than that. It's like the council turns down a specific plan for 4,000 square foot lots, pulling a number out of thin air. The council says, we don't want that kind of housing product here. That sets precedent. It's allowed. Staff takes that to heart when people come in and request those sorts of things. Sometimes we don't want density next to existing single family. And so we'll work with the developer, okay, look, let's make these parcels larger and then make smaller parcels here and try to run that through. But those are the kinds of decisions that we have to be able to rely on, again, because it costs so much to get in front of you. Okay. I think I'm doing okay on time. I'm not getting the eagle eye from Brian. Let me teach you how to read an EIR. Now, an EIR has been under preparation. Now, the city attorney might want to plug their ears at this point. Been under preparation for a number of years before it gets to you. Technical study's been done. It's not uncommon for these things to be bought. You do not need to start from page 1 and go through the end of the page. The other thing I'll tell you is by the time it gets to you, it's already been in the public for at least 60 days. 45 days of mandatory, 10 days before you get it, and usually there's about a month and a half or 2 months where we're responding to comments. You could have looked at the EIR at any point between when it was issued to the public and when it shows up on your agenda. The first thing I'm going to tell you is skip all of it. Don't read the executive summary. Randy, you've heard this before, because it's wrong, right? It's out of date. It's old news. Skip to the end. Skip to the final EIR. The final EIR is also going to contain your response to comments. That will tell you who's angry at your project. They usually have hired very expensive attorneys to tell you what you did wrong. It will explain to you what your staff has done to respond to those comments. It will tell you what may have changed in terms of the project itself or mitigation measures in order to respond to those comments. Then read the findings, because the findings are going to tell you how to approve the project. Now, this is assuming you've read the project description and you know roughly what the project is. That's cut almost 3,000 pages down to about 100 pages. And you can skim some of that as well. And then if you have pieces of the EIR that sing to you, like I've had commissioners that were excited about hydrology, and they spent days on the hydrology report. I've had people excited about traffic, although traffic's gotten a whole lot less interesting now that we no longer care about level of service. At the end of the day, this is not a novel. This is information to help inform you on the probable decisions you're going to make, so you don't have to read the thing. All I implore you to do is to not sit up there and say, well, there's a lot of information here. I think it's a good project. I didn't get to read all of this, but I'm going to vote for it anyway. Please don't do that. That's as a request of a couple of city attorney friends of mine. But this will allow, this is how consultants do it. If we have to go to a meeting on short notice, we read the final, we read the comments, and we read the responses so that we know what we have to talk to, because most everything else has been taken care of within the document. I included in your PowerPoint a whole bunch of resources. The one I can recommend for the Planning Commission and for the council for that matter is the ILG Planning Commissioner's Handbook. It was ancient. I don't know if those of you have been on the commission for a while or back and forth, and you probably remember. It was an old binder. A couple of years ago, we rewrote it. It was a group effort, a bunch of consultants, the state, everybody. We all got together and rewrote it to provide information to you. If you go to, it used to be called Office of Planning and Research. Now it's called Land Use Something and Innovation. Yeah, during a budget deficit's when we changed the names of things. Anyway, they have a bunch of technical papers if you want to go down the rabbit hole of knowledge there. And of course, you can read CEQA, ILG. There's lots of different things that you can do. And of course, there's the plug for the handbook at the end of it. And now, questions.
Thank you, Director Kitzero and Mr. Teague, for sharing all this information with us. The council and the commissioners appreciate it. It was very informative. Council and commissioners, there are 10 of us, so if I would like to ask you to please press the button to request to speak, so we do this in an orderly fashion. Do we have any questions to start off with? This is just questions, not discussion.
Mayor, if I could just state one thing real quick.
Sure.
I want to thank Mark Teague for coming down and for PlaceWorks' employer for providing him to come down. He came down pro bono to do this for the great city of Menifee. So I want to give a plug out for them because we offered to pay him to come down and he goes, no, we'll take care of it. We want to make sure planning commissioners and city councils are well equipped to do their roles for local governments, and this is something that our company does pro bono for agencies when they ask us. So he came down from Sacramento, I believe, today. Don't hold his location where he lives. He used to live in Southern California. So
Thank you, Mr. Teague.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Okay, come on, there had to be questions. I went through a lot of material. Like, what happens when you deny a project? Anybody have that question? You want me to answer that? Oh, you better get in trouble.
Okay, Councilman Temple.
What happens when you deny a project?
It's a good thing you asked that. I've been waiting to answer that question. Yeah. Yeah. Who knew? Who knew? Denials are more complicated than approvals, even if it's a controversial project. And it's because you can be sued by the applicant if the project is consistent with your general plan and everything you've told everybody, and you made up an arbitrary reason to say no. You can be sued by the applicant. It's unusual to be sued by the public, but that has occurred. Those don't tend to go as well. But applicant suits, for example, the one I mentioned in San Diego, the applicant sued and the board had to approve the project ultimately. It gets really complicated in the legal world. Your attorney can advise you on this, but if you lose a lawsuit, you typically have to pay the other guy, at least for their costs of doing it. So that becomes a problem. We try not to bring projects before you that you don't want. We try really hard as a staff to bring you stuff that you do want. Now, that doesn't always work because sometimes you may want the Mercedes dealership and what I can offer you is another McDonald's because that's what's been asked for. But we try really hard not to bring stuff to you that you feel compelled to deny because there are almost always ramifications. Sometimes people just walk away and nothing happens. The majority of the time, that's what happens. But if you've got it in your general plan that this use is going to be on this corner and has been there for a while, and somebody comes in to propose that use, you know, that's kind of a bait and switch. You should have a good reason for the denial of that. Again, I'm a property rights guy. So you're abridging somebody's property rights, government should have a good reason to do that.
Any other questions from council or commissioners? Oh, all right. We have Chair Madrid.
Thank you, Mayor. So Mark, now we know what to do when you deny a project. So we deny a project at the Planning Commission, it goes to appeal to City Council, and then it comes back to Planning Commission.
It depends on how the council does it. The council can have a de novo hearing, which essentially means they're hearing the project as if they were you. Some ordinances, and I apologize, I did not read ours. You de novo? Okay. Some ordinances are different. People can only act on the points of denial. I won't go there since you don't have one of those. As a de novo hearing, the council doesn't have to send it back to you. They can decide on their own, and then they make their own findings. Now, what's interesting is the role of staff in this. So it's staff's recommendation to the Planning Commission, okay? Once the Planning Commission has made their recommendation, up or down, approval or denial, we rewrite the information, and that becomes the recommendation to the council. Our stuff is still in there, typically, because it's part of the record, but it's the Planning Commission's decision, not our recommendation that you'll be acting on.
So how do we avoid being sued in that situation?
By having a good reason to say no. Not just because you didn't like the cut of their jib or just making stuff up. And I don't mean to be glib about it, but I've heard some really goofball reasons for saying no to a project. And you just kind of cringe when you're in the audience and somebody says, well, yeah, I didn't like that he just showed up here. And one of my favorites, they couldn't be bothered to come to the meeting, so I'm denying the project. Well, that's a little harsh. And so those are the sorts of things. Basically, you're going to have to explain it. If you get sued, you're going to have to explain your action to the judge, and you should have it backed up with evidence in the record.
Mr.
Why.
Teague,
Yeah.
one of the things that we often recommend to, if you know in advance you want to deny something, working with staff to come up with findings of denial is one way to do it, or just asking for a pause and a continuance to the next council meeting in which we can work between then and this council meeting and the next council meeting to identify findings for denial. And then staff can, then you are relying on your professional teammates to help you and our legal counsel to create the findings for which a denial will stand up in the court. So,
And the way that normally, you're right, Brian, the way that normally is done is in the motion. I'd like to remand this back to staff to develop findings for denial on at least these 3 issues or 5 issues, whatever the number is. That gives us something to work on. Then the clerk has what they need to know that the action got taken, and then we bring it back. I would implore you not to make it at the next meeting. Give yourself 30 days or so in there.
City Manager Villa.
I have a question for Mark, and maybe to offer some perspective. You know, oftentimes, just about every project gets notification. We send out notices to the residents. It goes through several layers, right? Especially when you're doing an EIR. Plenty of notification, and then when it comes to the meeting, we often get a whole bunch of residents that come over and they complain about the project. Can you offer some perspective on how to react to that when the public says, this is the first time we heard about this, and then, what are some of the takeaways that a council and a commission can do to relate to the community, this has been vetted and things like that?
Those are great questions. And I mentioned at the very beginning that public outreach is something we all want, and we have a hard time getting people to come and pay attention. Many of the regulations require noticing within a certain radius of the project, 3, 6, 1,200 feet, depending on where you are and what you're doing. And we take those off of the latest assessor's roll. So we have an address, a situs address, and often we'll have an owner's address. And I keep all of those on the file. So I can show the mayor, I can show the chair, look, this is where the notices were sent. And if their name is on there, that's about as far as the law requires you to go. Now, that's the legal part of it. The other part of it, the community part of that is, if it's a controversial project, the EIR should not be the first time they hear about it. You should have your community meetings. I would put to you that one of the reasons general plans are so complicated to update is the first couple of meetings, I get people complaining about streetlights that are out, potholes that haven't been fixed, barking dogs, because the community doesn't go talk to the public on a regular basis. They don't feel that they can come and do this thing. And if you're going to have a controversial project, set up some workshops. Have it on your agenda for your meetings for a couple of weeks. Hey, we have a workshop coming up on this. We implore you all to go out there. Make sure it's on your website. You can only do what you can do. You can't force people to pay attention. You can't force people to attend your meetings. And the tired trope of, I didn't find the notice, I used to have an old boss that said, you're here, aren't you? So now that you're here, let's learn about the project, okay? So we do all sorts of things with the EIR. One of the things I was going to tell you on the website is OPR now requires us to upload all of the documents. So you can go in any city in California, and you can pull down an EIR for a project that they've done, or you can pull down project information from any city and take a look at it. And it all has to be searchable. So there are other ways of getting information out there. Use your website. If you have a community information officer, CIO, make sure they get it out there. But I got to tell you, Armando, I've spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in outreach over the years. And until it's right next door, you're not going to fill the room with a whole lot of people.
Mayor Pro Tem Carwin.
Thank you. Regarding appeals, I know that we talked about it being de novo, meaning it's like the original hearing didn't happen. So what are your thoughts on council members attending or viewing the planning commission meetings of projects that they think are controversial and might be denied, and then using that knowledge in the de novo hearing? Should there be a total separation between the two? Is that knowledge proper, improper? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you're way out of my wheelhouse on this one. I'm going to defer to your city attorney on that one. I have my opinion, but I'm not going there.
To begin with, they're public meetings and you can attend. So there's no harm in attending live, and there's no harm in rewatching as part of your preparation, background research for a matter that is to come before the council. The point of caution to me would be, especially with quasi-judicial determinations, which are the vast majority of what you're talking about here, you shouldn't be expressing an opinion, forming an opinion, and laying that opinion down in those earlier meetings and forums, because it can compromise your ability to act as a determiner when the item comes before you.
So then is the recommendation that council members don't attend planning commission for the purposes of gaining knowledge on a project?
No, there is no problem with that. The recommendation is that council members don't engage in advocacy over that project at that planning commission meeting.
So don't get up and speak?
Yeah.
Right, okay, thanks.
Councilman Dynas.
Thank you. A few questions on, you're talking about, project A comes and it's denied, and then at the project A, goes to court and wins, and so therefore it comes back to the city has to approve it. Now, project B comes, which is fairly similar, but not exactly the same. Is there any precedent that lawsuit that we've lost have on another project, or does each one look differently that we can say, well, yeah, that one was different, but this one we're not going to deny, even though we denied that one, and they're basically the same?
Depends on how much overlap there is, really. I look at every project individually, but if the reason you denied the last project was because it used peanut butter and jelly and this is using peanut butter and jam, that's a little too close for comfort. But if they truly are different projects, I don't know that one necessarily begets another. It really does depend on the facts of the case. This is one of the reasons why I don't like to read a lot of the attorneys' opinions of the case until I've read the case, because everybody has a spin on it. And you have to look at the project with its own merits and make your decision that way. And then your staff and your attorney will be able to tell you, hey, look, the last time we did this, we got in trouble because of these reasons. If these are the same reasons we're denying the project, let's not do that.
Okay. In your slide here, they had a statement of overriding consideration. You talk about, well, it'll bring jobs and revenue and stuff like that. But one of the things that says, your points here says we need the dollars, isn't likely to survive a challenge. What's the difference between saying, well, it brings jobs, and saying we need the money? I mean, is it more nuanced, saying, oh, it brings jobs, that's positive, but we need the money is negative?
That's exactly right. I'm not going to pretend there's any magic to that stuff. It is all nuanced, and some of them I read, well, we're going to build a shopping center because we need the sales tax. And then we need the jobs associated with the shopping center. And then sales tax from the shopping center will be used to pay for a police officer. And they're all saying the same thing. That's probably not going to survive. But just saying, hey, we need the money as your single finding isn't going to survive either, or may not survive. Again, if I could predict what judges were going to do every single time, I'd probably be working for a prestigious law firm instead of actually working for a living. So a lot of this stuff depends on the judge, the court, the circuit, the conditions, and the facts of the case. I used to work with a fellow by the name of Dan Curtin, who was somewhat of an idol in our career field. And Dan would say that more than one case was lost because of the belligerent agency. And he would give examples about how they were just annoying the judge, and then finally said, all right, watch. And, yeah, one doesn't annoy a judge indiscriminately.
Commissioner Ramirez.
Thank you so much for all this information. It's a lot. But I recall that you said that you've written objective EIRs, and then there's been some you've been asked to integrate some, political.
In the findings.
In the findings. So how do we know what comes before us is truly objective?
If I wrote it, it's
Okay, so I'll look for your name.
done. My work here is complete. You want to make sure that there aren't terms in there. We recommend the city do this. The EIR should be very boring. It should be matter of fact. It should be factual, just like a soil study, just like a traffic, well, let's not use traffic. It's like a noise study. It should be measurable and objective. The findings and everything that go through that should all be objective. My opinion on whether the project is good or bad should never appear in the document. The EIR, the negative deck, should never tell you how to vote. It is simply one piece of information. Now, the part that I find weird is the statement of overriding considerations is put in the findings. So I write 70 pages of findings, which is essentially the EIR without pictures. And then there's 3 to 4 pages of saying, well, ignore all that. This has got to be happy. And the agency's like, you got to write these findings. Well, hey, I don't know your community well enough. And so that becomes more of a collaborative effort. But that's the part of this that if I could bifurcate that, put the statement of override in your resolution as attachment A or B, and put the findings in the resolution, right, separately. So it isn't, I can help you write them because I know how to write them, but at the end of the day, it needs to come from the agency. Look, we've looked at the entirety of the record. We know these mushrooms are rare, but this is the only site we have, and we need to develop it. And we're willing to do this. We've done these mitigation measures, but at the end of the day, we're still going to have to kill this mushroom. We're going to do the project. That's fine. That's a governmental decision. That is necessarily the point of being elected to the council, to make those decisions for your community. Shouldn't be the EIR consultant writing those. My opinion, your opinions may vary, but that's kind of how I feel about it. Will help, of course, but if it were me, I would separate the two.
Councilman Diedrich.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of had the reverse question of Mayor Pro Tem Carwin's questions. So I was wondering about the appropriateness of a commissioner after a decision's been made and it goes to city council, either from an appeal or because it was a recommendation going up. I've personally, when I was on planning commission, I've been approached by people to come speak at the city council meeting after the planning commission made their decision, right, as to why I came to that conclusion, or in support or against or whatever. Is that appropriate? Is that something that should be done, shouldn't be done?
I'll defer to the legal person, but I will suggest to you that you're one commissioner, right? So be careful that you're not representing the whole commission. If it's just your opinion, I think that's legit, but let's hear from the boss.
I personally never took advantage of that, but I was asked.
For whatever it's worth, Councilman Dietrich, I think Mr. Teague nailed it. It's free country. You can come and speak your mind on a project, even if you ruled on it at the Planning Commission. You can come speak your mind in front of the City Council about it. Totally welcome to do that. We have a policy here that when somebody who sits on a commissioner committee shows up in front of another body, they make it clear that they're speaking for themselves and not for that other body. That other body already spoke in your hypothetical. They adopted a motion and made a recommendation to the council, and that speaks for itself.
Chair Madrid.
Thank you, Mayor. So, Mark, I have a question. Speaking about what's appropriate, not appropriate, when we have a planning commission meeting and a public speaker comes up and he's representing another city and is recommending to deny our project, is it advisable to respond to him when it's proper in the meeting, or should we just let that ride? Or it bothers me a lot. That's what I'm telling you.
It kind of bothers me because I'm an old school planner. I kind of like, if I'm going to oppose the project, I'm going to come talk to the city manager. I'm going to talk to the planning director. We're going to be behind the scenes, and then if I'm directed by my council to come in front of you and lay something out. I've done it, I've had to do it, but I always try to be respectful, and the commissions have always been respectful because they kind of understand the awkward position the staff's in. This is a decision made by another agency to come and essentially mess with your barbecue, and that's not done lightly. So something's broken down if we're having to do that. I'm more of the coffee cup kind of guy. Let's go have a cup of coffee. Let me tell you what our worry is, and you tell us what your worry is, and we work it out together and bring the solution. When cities fight, it's taxpayer money being spent kind of really to no end.
Well, I just simply want to ask, why do you oppose every project that's at your city limits?
Yeah, well, that's a discussion between communities when they should sit down with their general plans and say, do our general plans match at the edge of the city? And the fundamental reason why cities oppose is you're going to put the Mercedes dealership on your side of the city limit line, so you get the sales tax, but a lot of the customers are going to be on their side of the city line. I mean, you've been set up to be at each other's throats by the way the process has been loaded ahead of you.
And the conditions of approval are already set.
Yeah.
So, all right, thank you, Mark.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I'll move on to the public comment portion. Madam Clerk, are there any requests to speak or has any correspondence been received?
No correspondence and no public speakers.
Okay. Now it's open for discussion. If any council members or commissioners would like to discuss or make any comments, this is the time for that. Okay, seems like Chair Madrid.
Yes, Mayor, I'd just like to thank our staff and our city council for working together with us on making these important decisions.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I would also like to say thank you to our city executive office and Mr. Teague for coming out, especially pro bono. We really appreciate that and your service to our city. There is no action required for tonight's item. Hearing no discussion, this meeting is adjourned at 5:34. Good night, Menifee.